This is BBC News, and these are the top stories developing at midday. Donald Trump cancels his visit to the UK next month, but Downing Street insists the strong and deep partnership will endure. Meanwhile, the UN's Human Rights Office says the president's foul-mouthed description of some countries is shocking, shameful and racist. Dozens of firefighters have been battling a huge blaze at Nottingham railway station. The station is shut, causing major travel disruption.
It's been an incredibly demanding incident. Our crews have worked very hard to try and contain it.
A breakthrough in talks to form a new government in Germany as Chancellor Angela Merkel's Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats agree a deal. Younger women with early breast cancer and faulty BRCA genes do not need to rush into having a double mastectomy to improve their chances of survival, a study suggests. Also changes to your Facebook feed. The social media site says it will prioritise interactions between family and friends over media and business content. And as the Queen marks 65 years since her coronation, Her Majesty lifts the lid on what life is like when you have to wear a heavy crown.
You can't look down to read the speech, you have to take the speech up. Because if you did, your neck would break, it would fall off.
Hello, a very good afternoon to you. It is Friday, the 12th of January. I'm Anita McVeigh, and welcome to BBC Newsroom Live. Donald Trump has confirmed he won't be visiting Britain next month. The US president was due to come over to mark the official opening of the new American embassy in South London. But President Trump tweeted that he'd cancelled his planned visit because he wasn't a big fan of the new embassy, which he said had been commissioned by his predecessor, Barack Obama. The move was actually initiated in 2008 under the George W. Bush administration. Downing Street says an invitation for a state visit has been accepted, but there's no firm date set, and insists the strong and deep partnership will endure. And in the last short while, the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has hit back at comments from the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, who was saying he was pleased that the president wasn't coming. And Boris Johnson tweeted, "The US is the biggest single investor in the UK, yet Khan and Corbyn seem determined to put this crucial relationship at risk." He says, "We will not allow US-UK relations to be endangered by some puffed-up, pompous popinjay in City Hall." Meanwhile, the US president is facing a backlash over comments he was reported to have made in a private meeting with lawmakers in the Oval Office about a proposed immigration deal. Mr. Trump aimed a foul-mouthed outburst at Haiti, El Salvador and several African countries. The United Nations says the comments are racist. Dan Johnson reports.
After nearly 60 years flying above London's Grosvenor Square, the Stars and Stripes were lowered this week, ready for the opening of the new US Embassy. It's a billion-dollar building on the South Bank, and Donald Trump was due to officially open it next month. Now we know he won't, and early this morning he posted his reasons on Twitter. "I am not a big fan of the Obama administration having sold perhaps the best located and finest embassy in London for peanuts," he wrote, only to build a new one in an off location for $1.2 billion. Bad deal. Wanted me to cut ribbon? No. But did the prospect of protests like this also put him off? This was the response to his ban on travellers from certain Muslim countries. A petition drew 1.8 million signatures with calls to ban him.
It shouldn't be a state visit because it would be embarrassing to the Queen and also to the rest of the UK.
Theresa May was the first world leader to reach out to the new president, and a return trip, a state visit, was promised soon. But then the president strained the special relationship by sharing online far-right videos from the group called Britain First. When Theresa May condemned, he even retorted. But just last weekend, she confirmed the invite still stands.
He is taking decisions in the best interests of the United States.
And he's coming to this country?
He will be coming to this country.
The Foreign Secretary denied the Queen would be embarrassed.
I think Her Majesty the Queen is well capable of taking this American president, or indeed any American president, in her stride, as she has done over 6 remarkable decades.
Let's be clear, opening this place was never the same as a state visit. It would have been a shorter, less formal trip. Meeting the Queen is still on, expected this year, though no date's been set. The president's denying this decision was down to politics, but after he offended more countries with a foul-mouthed remark last night, the list of places he's welcome certainly isn't growing. Dan Johnson, BBC News.
And let's talk now to our correspondent John Donnison, who's outside the new US Embassy building in South London, and joined somewhere in the background there, John, by a waxwork of Donald Trump, which is quite the draw, I think, judging by the pictures I've been seeing in the last short while. But the tweet that Donald Trump wrote, and apparently giving his reason for cancelling this visit, is based on erroneous information, isn't it?
That's right. President Trump, in that tweet, he basically blamed the decision to move the embassy from that location in Mayfair to here in Vauxhall, south of the river, on President Obama. He said it was a bad deal that had been done. Well, in fact, the decision to move the embassy was made in October 2008, and that was under President George W. Bush, a Republican president. Let's just have a little look, though, at this waxwork Donald Trump now, who's turned up and provided a bit of entertainment for the construction workers, just putting the finishing touches to this embassy, provided by Madame Tussauds, and absolutely uncanny, I have to say. Quite unnerving when you stood right up close next to him.
And in terms of then a state visit, John, whose court does the ball lie in? Is it very much now that the invitation has been extended for the US, for the Trump administration, to decide what happens next and dictate the timetable?
Well, we've had a statement from the Prime Minister's spokesperson this morning saying that President Trump is welcome here in the United Kingdom, and that the invitation has been extended and has been accepted. But we certainly don't have any sort of date set for that. And given that this visit, which was to be on a smaller scale, but there might have been a chance to meet the Prime Minister as well as the Queen in February, that is now not going to happen. And it's got to call into question whether the state visit will take place this year or indeed at all.
OK, John, thank you very much. John Donnison in South London for us. And with me now in the studio is Leslie Vinjamuri, who is Associate Fellow of the US and America's Programme at the independent international affairs think tank Chatham House. And Leslie, do you think when we consider this and also the comments called out as racist by the United Nations that Donald Trump is reported to have made in an Oval Office meeting, do you think that this state visit to the UK will ever happen?
Well, I imagine that it's something that we're going to continue to debate for the next several months, that Donald Trump and Theresa May and the people surrounding them will have very serious conversations. It is a visit that Donald Trump would like to take under the right conditions, and that Theresa May, as we know, has extended her hand continually. The great shame about this canceled visit, of course, is that if you look at that American embassy, it has the potential to be symbolically at the heart of the US-UK relationship. It's $1 billion building. It's very open. Remember, that decision was taken by George W. Bush because there was a move to make embassies much more secure in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. It's actually quite open. It's at the heart of a $15 billion regeneration project in London. It could have been the president saying, you know, here we are, we're contributing to the UK, we're contributing to London. And instead what we've seen is the president take a very negative position, and one that's making it very difficult for the ambassador and for the US embassy staff to have the kind of opening that they'd like to have.
Well, let's talk more about the symbolism, if we can, Leslie, and the symbolism of the office of President of the United States as opposed to the person occupying that office at any given time, and the fact that Donald Trump as president has visited, for example, all the other G8 countries apart from the UK. What does that say going forward, especially as the UK is very keen to negotiate a trade deal post-Brexit, as we all know?
Well, that's right. And I think the key thing here is that at the level of leadership, there's a very strong commitment to this visit. But at every other level, it's very difficult. If you look at the numbers that came out from Pew, the data on public attitudes in the UK towards the US By June of this year, they had sunk to 22% confidence that the American president would do the right thing. If you look at the debates in Parliament after President Trump retweeted those videos that were released by the far-right extremist group Britain First, and the reaction in Parliament calling into question a state visit. If you look at his response to Sadiq Khan in the aftermath of the attacks on the Westminster Bridge, just very negative reactions across the UK. So it makes it very difficult strategically for the leadership to do what it wants to do when it really needs that trade deal and that relationship to be very firm.
It's interesting, in light of what you say, that tweet from Boris Johnson, which doesn't really directly address, I think, the criticism of Donald Trump today, but talks about the US being the biggest single investor in the UK. Yet Khan and Corbyn seem determined to put this crucial relationship at risk. You can see why he's focusing on the trade relationship, the economic relationship, rather than perhaps directly addressing either the decision not to come to the UK next month or those racist comments as described by the United Nations.
Yes, but I think it would be wise to acknowledge the broader controversy. You've got to be able to bring the public alongside you. You've got to be able to make it easier for Parliament to welcome a U.S. leader. And you can't really do that if you don't hold firm a bit on the racist language, on the very destructive language, while acknowledging the broader significance. You know, this is a relationship that is not about the leaders. It's multi-layered. It's about intelligence. It's about people. It's about history. And you've got to capture that relationship, but also hold firm, I think, on the significance of the symbolism that comes out of a president who uses the kind of language and the dismissive tone that this president has used.
And just finally, Leslie, do you agree with the assessment by some that these comments, foul-mouthed comments about certain countries, mark a new low from President Trump?
It's a new low. And remember that in the context of efforts to protect those children who came to the United States who are still undocumented, that's the context in which this comment was made by the president. And now it puts that initiative really at risk. And in the U.S. context, it makes it very difficult for those around the president to work with him to create an effective and thoughtful response to the dilemma of immigration, current immigration dilemmas in the United States.
OK, Leslie, thank you very much. Leslie Vinjamuri from Chatham House.
Thank you.
A large fire has broken out at Nottingham Railway Station. Nottinghamshire Fire and Rescue say they've been dealing with a large incident with 8 appliances in attendance. The station was evacuated. East Midland Trains say all trains through the station are cancelled and they expect disruptions for the rest of the morning. Well, John Mills from Nottinghamshire Fire and Rescue Service gave us this update on the operation so far.
Right, this morning around about 6:30 we received a fire call to Nottingham train station. This was an incident that was contained initially in the toilets. Upon arrival it became very evident to our crews that we had a developed fire within the toilet area of the building. This incident rapidly progressed and spread, that has involved the overfoot pass, the bridge that goes over and that connects the platforms. It's been an incredibly demanding incident. Our crews have worked very hard to try and contain it. We always have as our first priority life risk, so it was initially persons reported, so we were looking for people because this has happened in the midst of rush hour, a very busy time for the station and a very busy time for the city. What we have then done is we have requested more fire engines, so we've rapidly gone from 3 to 5 to 8. We are now running at 12 fire engines. This fire has progressed into voids, which makes it incredibly difficult for us to fight. So it's a demanding job in that respect. I'm delighted to be able to report that at the time of this interview, no one has been injured. So we've got no casualties and no injuries, which is always great news from an emergency service perspective. I have to emphasise this isn't a single emergency service incident. This is very much a joint team approach. We have the East Midlands Ambulance Service, British Transport Police, the representatives from the train station itself. So it's very much a team approach. We're asking people to be patient with us and have an understanding that we've had to close roads in order to deal with this incident, and we're working as hard as we can to try and bring the station back online so that business can resume as soon as possible.
Now, eyewitnesses say the scene at the station earlier had been chaotic.
We stayed overnight in the Jury Inn, which is just across the road over there, and we come up by train yesterday from London. We can't now get back, there's no trains, and our friend had actually got his car in the car park, which is just behind us, and he's obviously called with him, can't get it out, so we're now stuck. There's no trains, no bus service, no nothing. So yeah, we're properly affected, yeah.
And did you see the smoke this morning? Did you see anything?
So from the hotel room, see the smoke and the fire, heard all the fire engines this morning. It was quite chaotic, to be fair, but I think by sounds of it, they responded really quickly, which is really good, and hopefully no one's hurt, so.
The headlines now on BBC Newsroom Live, and the time is exactly 12:15. Donald Trump cancels his visit to the UK next month, but Downing Street insists the strong and deep partnership will endure. Dozens of firefighters have been battling a huge blaze at Nottingham railway station. The station is shut, causing major travel disruption. And a breakthrough in talks to form a new government in Germany between Chancellor Angela Merkel's Christian Democrats and their former coalition partners, the Social Democrats. It's time for sport now. Let's get the very latest with Hugh. Hello, Hugh.
Hello, good.
Now, there's been a breakthrough in talks in Germany on forming a new coalition government. After overnight talks, Chancellor Angela Merkel's Conservative Christian Democrats and their former coalition partners, the left-wing Social Democrats, have agreed a basis upon which a coalition treaty can be negotiated, opening the way to formal talks. Germany has had a caretaker government since inconclusive elections in September. Let's talk to our correspondent Jenny Hill, who joins me now from Berlin. Hello again, Jenny. And we're talking about a new coalition government, but in some ways the old coalition government if these two parties get together again. But it's not quite there yet, is it?
No, it isn't. And this morning, as an exhausted Mrs. Merkel stumbled out of those all-night talks, fuelled, we're told, by currywurst, to greet waiting reporters, she looked very relieved. She was smiling, but Mrs. Merkel knows that while she appears to have clinched this deal, there's still a very long way to go. And that's because these were exploratory talks, the first round of talks in the coalition building process, designed primarily to work out whether it's even worth trying to proceed with formal coalition negotiations. So they've decided that there is clearly just about enough agreement to go forward with the formal round of talks. But before that can happen, Mrs. Merkel and the leader of the Social Democrats, her would-be coalition partners, have to get the go-ahead from the Social Democrat Party itself. They're holding a special party conference towards the end of the month where they'll vote on whether formal talks can happen. If they do, and a formal coalition treaty is eventually drafted, the membership will also get to vote on that. So there's a couple of stumbling blocks potentially there. And Mrs. Merkel herself admitted today that there are tricky times ahead. And that's because the Social Democrats, having been in power with her before, largely blame her and that coalition for a very poor showing in September's general election. There's still a lot of antipathy within the Social Democrat Party towards another 4 years in government with Mrs. Merkel. So it's going to be very interesting to see how they react in the coming weeks and possibly months to the proposals put to them. But Mrs. Merkel knows that she's not quite out of the woods yet.
Yes, on that point, Jenny, how shaken is Angela Merkel's position by all of this, because she has been apparently in a very strong position for such a long time as not just the German leader, but as a European leader and a world leader. But this has changed things, hasn't it?
It has, not least because she's been very preoccupied by domestic concerns. She's not been as prominent a figure on the world stage as per normal. Mrs. Merkel is weakened as a figure here, and more internationally too. First of all, by her poor election result in September. She led her Conservatives to one of their worst ever election results. Secondly, because she failed at her first attempt to build a coalition with two other parties last year. And now, well, today it looks as though she might have kept the wolf from the door for a little while. But I think what's really important to bear in mind here is that whilst in the past she's survived political crises because there's been no one really deemed good enough within her party to replace her, her party has now had a few months in which to start looking around for a potential successor. If and when there's a new government, this will be Mrs. Merkel's fourth and most people presume last term. There are big question marks actually here over whether she'll even serve the whole duration of that term. And there are certainly people here who say, well, if she'd not managed to secure an agreement overnight, she'd have been political toast. I'm not sure I would go that far, but you do get the sense that her era is coming towards an end. And certainly now her party is, I think, really starting to look around at who could replace her when the time comes.
OK, Jenny, thank you very much for that. Jenny Hill in Berlin. A study of women with breast cancer suggests that having a double mastectomy doesn't increase the chances of survival in younger patients who have what's known as the BRCA gene. The researchers also found that women treated for breast cancer had the same survival rates, regardless of whether or not they had the mutation. A little earlier, the report's author, Professor Diana Eccles, spoke to the BBC's Victoria Derbyshire programme about the significance of these findings.
So the first thing to absolutely stress is that all of the patients in this study came along with a diagnosis of breast cancer. So these were not people who had no cancer but knew they were at high risk and so were electing bilateral mastectomy. That's really important to get clear. They're very, very different circumstances. Our study was looking at young women between 18 and 40 who had developed a breast cancer. Usually they'd found a lump, so they weren't being screened. Most of them did not know they were BRCA gene carriers, and we followed them for a long period of time. We looked at ladies diagnosed between 2000 and 2008, and we've been following their medical records ever since then, and we've finally been able to work out who does and doesn't carry a BRCA gene mutation. So the findings of the study are that 12% of those younger women with breast cancer had a BRCA gene mutation, and that the outcome from the conventional breast cancer treatment for those people was no different to those that didn't have a BRCA gene mutation once you took all the breast cancer characteristics into account. So the breast cancer treatment was appropriate, and it was based on their BRCA gene. It's based on their breast cancer status rather than their BRCA status.
Professor Diana Eccles. An 18-year-old from the Scottish Highlands has died after contracting the flu virus. Bethany Walker was airlifted to hospital in Inverness from her home in Wester Ross, but her illness had developed into pneumonia and staff were unable to save her. Elsewhere in England, there's been a sharp rise in the number of flu cases seen by GPs, up 78% from last week. Police in North Wales have confirmed that a 6-month-old baby has died following a car crash with a lorry yesterday. A passenger in the car was pronounced dead at the scene, and the driver and baby were airlifted to Liverpool's Alderhay Hospital after both sustained life-threatening injuries. Nigel Farage has clarified remarks he made yesterday calling for a second EU referendum. The former UKIP leader has said although another vote was the last thing he wanted, he thought it might be forced on the country by Parliament. His initial remarks were seized upon by Remainers, with Labour's Chuka Umunna saying Mr Farage had made a valid point for the first time in his life. Facebook has announced what it says is a major change to its newsfeed. The social website will refocus on interactions between family and friends rather than media and business content. It means that people will see fewer posts from companies and public organisations. Well, with me now is Elizabeth Linder, a former Facebook executive. Elizabeth, thank you very much for joining me today. And we were just having a brief chat before this conversation, and you said this is about Facebook getting back to what it was originally.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we have to remember Facebook started as a platform for people to connect mostly with friends, for college students, and then of course people started to add in family members and colleagues. The newsfeed launched in 2006, and anybody who was on Facebook at the time remembers this moment. It was a seminal moment for Facebook, hugely controversial, because the kinds of information that people were putting onto Facebook suddenly generated a story, and that was a big deal at the time. But it's largely credited to being the single most important part of Facebook's product to ensure that people come back and back and back to the service.
So not quite a reinvention, but would you say, as an earlier commentator said to me, that it's actually about ensuring the longevity of Facebook?
I think so. I think the piece of this announcement that I would focus on most is the language that Mark Zuckerberg uses in his post on Facebook to describe it. He uses words like meaningful, like time well spent. Time well spent is a movement that started back in Silicon Valley by Tristan Harris to say, how do we ensure that technologies with the potential to be somewhat addictive and use a fair amount of our time are not just meaningless to our lives or actually creating harm, but are somehow, how can we measure the ability of these services to do good, to create better, more healthy, more productive societies? Now, this is a fascinating space because nobody exactly knows how to measure it yet. How do you measure well-being through social media?
So Zuckerberg is trying to get ahead of the trend, do you think, with this?
Exactly. Reputationally, it's extremely important for Facebook, especially in today's political climate.
Well, on that point, that brings me on to my next question. How much has this been driven by, what Mark Zuckerberg is saying, this desire to get more touchy-feely and warm and fuzzy again? How much has it been driven actually by, the need to push back from fake news intruding into social media platforms, accusations of political interference, etc.?
I think it's both. At the end of the day, Facebook has to ensure that people are coming back and back and back to the product. This is a very competitive space. When people are, going into their phones, what is the first thing they're going to do? From a Facebook perspective, that has to be going straight onto one of the Facebook products. And so if people are turning away from Facebook because they fear that either the content is not interesting or relevant to them, or because Facebook is somehow creating an anger-fueled type of approach to the way that we lead our lives, that can be detrimental and extremely harmful for Facebook long term. So I think this is both. It's ensuring that people are happy with the service that it's providing, but it's also Facebook providing a bit more of a moral stake in saying we actually need to figure out how to connect the world and make the world better as a result. And that's a big game changer from the way that the company has thought about the newsfeed in the past.
Very interesting to talk to you, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. Elizabeth Linder, former Facebook executive. It's time now for the weather. Let's head across the newsroom and join Helen Willits as we look towards the weekend. Helen.
Thanks, Anita. And it's business as usual, really, as we go through this weekend. It's dry for many and grey. Fog has been an issue once again today. This was in Shropshire just a little earlier. We've another shot in North Yorkshire as well. In fact, parts of East and North Yorkshire have seen more fog today as well. The hope is that the weekend we'll see it lifting a bit more because the breeze is starting to pick up as well. However, as you can see, we go through the evening and overnight and we get some rain and stronger winds from Northern Ireland, so at least it's a little bit less foggy here, but there'll be some patches of fog elsewhere across England and Wales, Scotland too, and temperatures close enough to freezing for it to be a freezing fog as well, or even just some frost. But tomorrow, don't forget, we've still got our weak weather front with us, as well as the weather front that's coming into the west. So all in all, that just spells a lot of cloud. Probably the best of the sunshine will be the north of Scotland. But again, with more breeze, as I hinted at, we could see at least the cloud bases being higher. So it might appear a little bit brighter than it has done this week, with a little bit of sunshine as well. Then it peters out, that weather front, through the night, but it doesn't really go away. As we move into Sunday, we've still got some patchy rain around, and then this wetter, windier weather to come in later in the day. All change by the time we get to Monday.